Welcome to episode 34 of the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. On today's episode, we are going to talk about complementary and alternative medicine. So, complementary and alternative medicine is often abbreviated as CAM or CAM, and we'll talk more about whether that is a good way of referring to these modalities in a bit. But we will define CAM more as we get into the episode, but just to give you a sense, this is things like acupuncture, chiropractic, aromatherapy, essential oils, homeopathy, herbal medicine, Reiki, and the list goes on and on. So we'll get into what all of these different modalities have in common, how they compare and contrast with conventional medicine. And really, the reason that we're talking about this is because of the role that these modalities play in the larger wellness industry. And particularly, what's relevant to us is that in the yoga world, these modalities are very popular, and the yoga world is very intertwined with the wellness industry. For example, we often see CAM modalities offered alongside yoga. For example, the combination of yoga and Reiki, or the combination of acupuncture with restorative yoga. So many yoga practitioners even participate in CAM modalities for their own healthcare. And so all of that just situates these modalities very much within the yoga world and the wellness industry as a whole, which is why it's so relevant to us for this podcast. For this episode, we are joined by a very special guest. This guest is Jonathan Jarry, who is a science communicator from McGill University's Office for Science and Society, which is located in Montreal. This Office for Science and Society is an organization dedicated to science education. It operates out of McGill University, and it uses courses, mass media, special events, and books to debunk pseudoscientific myths and improve scientific literacy. Jonathan has his master's degree in molecular biology and brings experience in cancer research, human genetics, rehabilitation research, and forensic biology to the work he does for the public. In addition to all that, he co-hosts the award-winning medical podcast, The Body of Evidence, and is frequently quoted in local, national, and even international media on issues of science and pseudoscience, and was recently just quoted in a book for the first time, which hopefully we can hear more about. So
two books now.
Two books. I undersold
Yes.
them. And last but not least, I just want to give a shout out because Jenny and I first were introduced to Jonathan through our friend Chris Hewen's podcast. His podcast is called the Adaptabilia Podcast. And so that was a great episode, and that's a great podcast. So we'll link that in the show notes. But Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us for this episode.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for the invitation.
It is so
Our
we're
pleasure.
yes, we're so excited that you decided to join us, and we really admire the work that you do and the really important education that you're offering to the public. And yeah, we see it as super valuable, and so we feel very lucky and fortunate to have you here with us today. And one of our first questions for you is just to ask you about the Office for Science and Society at McGill University in Montreal, where you work. That sounds like a very interesting organization, and unlike any that I've really heard about before. Can you tell us a bit about it?
As far as we know, we're the only university-based office that does this kind of work. So as I like to say, we are not doing sort of public relations or marketing work for the university, saying this is the research that's being done at McGill. This is not what we do. What we do is we answer the public's questions about science, especially health sciences. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of pseudoscience out there, a lot of lies, a lot of hype as well. And we try and sort of clear all of this mess and get to what the scientific evidence is saying and bring that to the public in a way that is understandable, where you don't need to have a PhD in biochemistry to understand what we're saying. So that's basically what we do and what we've been doing the office is over 20 years old at this point. I joined the office something like 5-ish years ago. And so, yeah, that's the work that we do.
Wow. Yeah, and it just sounds like such a valuable offering, especially to translate these concepts to like digestible terms that just general public can understand. Because, yeah, like you said, I mean, to really understand a lot of the science at a higher level can often take a lot of background knowledge and maybe higher degrees. And so you guys are just really offering such a great service by kind of distilling maybe more sophisticated information into terms that people can relate to and understand and make meaningful for them.
Yeah, it's becoming hard to figure out what is good science, what is bad science, and what is fake science or pseudoscience. Because every scientific field is becoming more and more specialized. You can go and find papers out there that seem to support any hypothesis that you have. And
Yeah.
if you're not scientifically literate enough to contextualize this study, to look at its limitations, and to look at the body of evidence on that topic, it's very easy to become seduced by these ideas and say, hey, look, it's backed up by good evidence. Look, I found a paper
Hmm.
about this. Yeah, but one paper usually isn't enough. So that's what we're trying to do as well, is really contextualize the claims that are being made. Was this done in mice? Was this done in petri dishes? Or have there been numerous randomized clinical trials about this? Because that's very different. The strength of the evidence is going to be very different depending on the methodology that is being used.
That is so true. Thank you for speaking to that. And that also reminds me that, like, in addition to, it seems like the individual subjects that you might focus on, or that the office might focus on and put out a video about, or some sort of post about, it also seems like at least you specifically, and probably the office in general, are just great at helping improve scientific literacy in general by just educating about some kind of fundamental foundational scientific concepts that often just the general public or general layperson doesn't even realize that they don't know about. Like, they might have a vague idea of what science is and that it's important, but when you actually look into it, there are a lot of facets there, right?
Yeah, there's a void to be filled because we have all these science centers and these science museums, and unfortunately, most of them cater to.
Right.
Well, I say unfortunately, I mean they cater mostly to children and to new families, new parents who have young kids, and that is very valuable. But then they kind of sell you science as this thing that kids are into, and so as something that then you grow out of. But the problem is that we all have to make decisions based on good science. Like, what are we going to eat? Is there a diet that is better than others? What kind of exercise is good for me? What has good evidence behind it? What about climate change? Is this real? I mean, how do we know these
Hmm.
things? So there are all these decisions that we have to make that are influenced and should be influenced by scientific knowledge. But then we're told, oh, science is this thing that kids are into. So our office and many other people, of course, not just us, but we're trying to fill that gap and show that no, science is important to adults as well. And we're trying to equip you with the knowledge and the context that you need to understand the science that impacts everyday life.
Wow. I've never even thought about that. Like, science museums tend to be for kids and like targeted
It's
as
a
this
it's a
family.
pet peeve of mine,
I
and
never
I've
thought about
spoken
that.
to people at science museums, and they're just perfectly happy with having this demographic. And yeah, that is important, but I
Yeah.
feel like there's also all of the adults out there who go out and they vote and they buy
Yes,
food and they have to
Jonathan.
make all these
Yes.
decisions. And it's like they should also be scientifically literate. They should also be interested in science. And science is fascinating, even for
Hmm.
adults. You just have to figure out how to explain it to people to make it interesting.
Absolutely. That is so well said. Well, one thing that we wanted to ask you about was, clearly you understand the scientific method very well. You're highly scientifically literate, and that I believe helps you in interpreting so much of the information that we're all inundated with all the time, and helps you interpret and then make suggestions based on your understandings of the scientific method. And we were wondering, as you kind of coming from that perspective, as maybe like a science advocate or a pro science person, or some people might use the term skeptic, being like embodying that type of role. We were wondering if there's like a backstory for you, in terms of your kind of embodying like that science advocate role, like were you someone who just kind of maybe grew up with science? You feel like you've always maybe had these understandings and maybe grew a little frustrated in seeing so much misinformation out there? Or did you possibly used to believe like some maybe a good amount of pseudoscience, and then maybe you learn more and kind of had a quote like awakening, and maybe that's part of your process in coming to where you are now? Do you know what I mean?
Yes. What is my origin story?
Yes, yes, please, for being where you are.
I was bitten by a radioactive spider. No, so
Like it.
I used to be much more Fox Mulder than Dana Scully, which I realize now is a reference that is getting more and more dated. I mean, I don't
Is
know if
that
you have like
X-Files?
X-Files, right?
yes. Oh
Okay, I
wow.
know my
Okay.
dad. My dad was a
My
big X-Files
So
fan,
funny.
so
I'm
I know
okay.
the
aware.
names. But
Am
Scully,
well,
I
is it
as old
X-Files is
as
Scully?
coming back,
Travis's
right?
dad? It yes, they
No,
have released newer seasons.
yeah,
Yeah, so this is what's a better reference? I don't know.
I think a
But
lot of our
basically,
listeners will know the reference.
okay, so there was a show in the early, well, in most of the 90s called The
Hmm.
X-Files,
It
which
was
I would
huge.
argue that and The Simpsons were like the two big cultural touchstones on television in the 1990s. And The
Agreed.
X-Files was a show that pitted a skeptic and a believer together. They were FBI agents. One of them, Fox Mulder, who was the believer, I believe his sister had been kidnapped by aliens allegedly, and so he became a believer in all of these kinds of phenomena. And he was relegated to the what they call the X files, these unexplained case files that the FBI had. And he became paired with Dana Scully, who was a physician, and she was a skeptic, and together they would explore, the X file of the week. And unfortunately, it always turned out that the skeptic was wrong and the believer was right.
It was
so
that
so
was
in
the
that year,
gist of the show. Oh my
as
god.
it almost always is in American media, right? The skeptic is there to be proven wrong, and by the end, it
Right.
turns out that yes, aliens are real, ghosts are real, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, so all that to say that I used to believe in all kinds of things when I was growing up. I was into ghosts and vampires and the Loch Ness monster and Yeti and like all of that stuff.
Wow.
And I went to university to study biochemistry, and I mean, there was no like road to Damascus or reverse road to Damascus or road out of Damascus moment for me. I just slowly start to understand science more and more, and I became more and more of a skeptic over the years. When you start to do laboratory work and you see how experiments
Hmm.
are done, and you start to discuss results, and you see how, you do an experiment and you expect result A or B and you get result C all the time. It changes how your brain works, and you start to understand that, okay, this stuff is hard, but in the end, it really pays off. And so all those big claims, these extraordinary claims that are not backed up by good scientific evidence, there's probably not much to them. So I sort of became more and more of a skeptic as the years went on. I started a PhD program that I quit after 3 years. I witnessed a lot of bad science around me. I was
Mm.
told to analyze data in bad ways when I was there as well. And so I also started to see problems with the way that scientific research was being done, because there are bad incentives in the system. It's a human
Right.
activity like any others. And so science is great, but science as it is done by humans is flawed in a myriad of ways. I mean, in the end, we get to the right answers, but it takes a while to get there, and it's somewhat inefficient. And so
Hmm.
that led me to want to do science communication and to bring this to the public, so that the public has a realistic expectation of what scientific research can deliver. And that's what I've
Right.
been doing for many, many years now, even before being recruited by McGill to do this with the OSS.
Oh wow. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing your backstory. I think many of us can relate to holding some of those beliefs. Like, I think that Yeti or Bigfoot is a really cool story to learn about and
Yes,
think about it.
and that is often the appeal of these things, is that they are cool stories, and we
Oh,
want to
yes.
believe, and we want to believe in these in magic, in a sense, in things that are
Yes.
beyond us, that seem amazing, that trigger this curiosity and this awe that we have. And when you're a scientist, you find this awe in the natural world, because, I mean, if you're an astrophysicist and you're learning about all these phenomena that are happening in deep space, it is incredible. If, like me, you studied molecular biology and genetics, I mean, learning about how, I mean, the intricacies of how our cells work, I mean, how there are these little cities that are so well organized, and all of these different molecules and all the stuff that they do, that is what provides awe to me.
Yes.
But before you learn about all this stuff, I mean, it's very tempting to get drawn into believing into vampires and werewolves and things of that nature, because it is, I mean, it does, I mean, it is cool. It's very cool.
Right. But when you really study science and learn much more about things that the scientific method studies, I think we definitely start to see that there's so much magic there. There's so much. It's it can be very
It's not magic, but it is,
right.
It
Maybe
has
that's
the
not
qualities
right
of
word.
magic, I guess.
Exactly. I think you used the word awe, and maybe that's like the right word. There's so much
it is.
awe.
It is awe-inspiring. Yeah.
100%. So our main focus for being here today is to talk with you, as Travis mentioned in the intro, about complementary and alternative medicine, which is often abbreviated to CAM. And we thought that in order for you to like offer us an education on that, it would make sense to like compare and contrast CAM to what might be called, and maybe you could tell us what term you like, but conventional medicine or modern medicine or science-based medicine, however we're going to refer to it. But maybe
or just medicine, right?
Yes,
Or as
Travis.
Dimension said, medicine.
Yes. So maybe before we dive into having you
Sure.
like talk about CAM, maybe you could explain for us like what is science-based medicine? What does that look like? What are the pillars and the qualities there?
Okay, so I'm not a medical doctor, right? But I've done a lot of work in the health sciences. I often consider myself to be a paramedic, not in the actual sense of the term, but in the sense of being next to medicine. So I've studied, I mean, my supervisors have often been physicians. I've worked in clinical labs. And so that's why I'm interested in health and medicine, even though I'm not a physician myself. But basically, medicine has had a very long evolution from believing that everything in the body can be divided into four humors, and this is the theory of disease, to using leeches and bloodletting for any kind of ailment. And there was a lot of, what we sometimes refer to as eminence-based medicine. Well, look, there's this one guy and we all revere him and he's a doctor and he says that in his practice, this works. And so I guess we're going to do that. So for a very long time, it was eminence-based medicine. And the idea of evidence-based medicine with a V is relatively recent. And it is this idea that, well, what doctors do should be based on good scientific evidence, which we kind of take for granted now, but for most of the history of medicine, that was not the case. And so, we're really looking at the 70s, 80s, and 90s when evidence-based medicine comes into its own, and when researchers and often like MD PhDs will start to do these randomized clinical trial where they are pitting an intervention against a placebo, for example, so something that is inert, that looks like the intervention, that is indistinguishable from it, but that doesn't really have anything in it, to see and to sort of randomize people into different groups that are comparable, and nobody knows in which group they are, and then you follow them and you see, can you see like specific effects of the intervention compared to the control arm? I'm oversimplifying, and there are other ways of doing clinical trials. When there's a standard of care, for example, you cannot deny the standard of care and put people on sugar pills, for example. But that's a basic idea of a randomized clinical trial, which is one of the most robust tools that we have to test interventions in the biomedical sciences. And so by doing these trials, we've discovered that some of the interventions in medicine didn't have good evidence behind. They didn't really work. And so hopefully you toss them out. Of course, there's always egos in the way. And so it can take some time before practices change. But that's the basic idea. And you can't always do a clinical trial. Sometimes it's unethical. Sometimes it's just not feasible. You can't force people on a diet for 50 years and see what happens. So sometimes you have to rely on what we might call lesser forms of evidence, observational studies, where you just see what naturally happens in people who choose to do a certain thing. And there are advantages and disadvantages to each of these types of, observational versus experimental studies. But the basic idea of evidence-based medicine is, hey, the physicians who are practicing medicine should be basing their interventions on good scientific evidence. Now, there's a distinction between evidence-based medicine and science-based medicine. And science-based medicine is advocated a lot by skeptics in that sphere. So people who believe that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. There is a website called Science-Based Medicine, run by Doctors David Gorski and Stephen Novella. And the distinction between evidence-based medicine and science-based medicine is that science-based medicine has one more thing in it, one more ingredient, and that is prior plausibility. And so that means that, okay, so given our understanding of biology and chemistry and physics, if we have something to test, well, if the claim is completely outrageous and it would rewrite the books on biology and chemistry and physics, maybe we shouldn't be wasting our research funds testing that hypothesis. And so maybe because what happens is that when you test a number of things, you're going to get a positive result by chance alone at some point. Mm-hmm. And the light that science-based medicine can cast is to say, yeah, okay, you did 7 trials of Reiki, and we'll get into Reiki, I'm sure. You did 7 trials of Reiki, and one of them was positive. And evidence-based medicine might say, well, that's 1 out of 7. That's interesting. And science-based medicine goes, yeah, but what is the prior plausibility of Reiki being true? What is a plausibility that we have this energy field around us that's never been really detected or measured by science, and that you can manipulate it with your hands? The plausibility is very, very, very low. And so you have to put that in the balance when you're looking at that 1 out of 7 positive result. So that is a distinction between evidence-based medicine and science-based medicine. I would say that right now, what physicians are trying to practice is evidence-based medicine, but there are people in that field who are trying to bring this up to science-based medicine and say, look, when we are studying extraordinary claims, we have to take into account their prior plausibility when we look at the results of those studies. Did that make sense at all?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Thank you. We're actually going to ask you about that distinction between those two terms, and if you had an explanation for that, and if that distinction is important to you, like, do you go out of your way to say science-based medicine versus evidence-based, or in a sense, could they be interchangeable depending on, I guess?
Well, I mean, they're not interchangeable. I mean, they do mean different things. And so I try to use the correct phrase depending on the context.
Excellent. Thank you for explaining. That makes so much sense about taking prior plausibility into account and not necessarily treating, I don't know if it would be correct to say just treating all hypotheses as like on similar footing or something, but just
right, because they're not all, they don't have all of the same plausibility before you start testing them. Some of them you go, well, that's plausible given our understanding of human biology, of just basic biology and biochemistry, molecular biology. And then there are others where it comes out of left field completely, and you go, well, that would be very strange if this were true. So we should be very, very careful when we look at the results of your study and pay specific attention to the possibility that maybe you just got a false positive result, which happens all the time in science, right? So that's the distinction that I think is important to make.
Absolutely. That's super helpful to have you explain. So now that you've kind of given us a good definition and some foundational terms for thinking about science-based medicine and what that looks like and what that means, maybe now could you explain for us just kind of in broad conceptual terms, what is CAM, or complementary alternative medicine? Like what's the definition of CAM?
I can tell you what it is not,
Okay,
and
yeah, that's
we're going to
helpful.
kind of
Yeah.
we'll sort of circle around what it is and what it can be. When I and we were discussing this before we were recording, but when I write about this stuff, and I do a lot of writing for the OSS,
Oh, right.
mcgill.ca/OSS, if you're looking for our stuff. When I write about this, about CAM, I tend to write it as so-called alternative medicine or so-called complementary and alternative medicine because I don't really agree with the use of the word medicine in there. But
Hmm.
the way that they would describe it, their proponents, is that alternative medicine is literally an alternative to conventional medicine. And complementary medicine is meant to be something that you take on top of conventional medicine.
Mm.
And CAM, just to use that as a shorthand, CAM has gone through a number of different rebranding exercises over the years. And the latest one is integrative medicine or integrative health. And it's this
Hmm.
idea that, okay, well, we recognize that CAM is not perfect. You need conventional medicine. So we need to integrate the two of them so that we get the best of both worlds. So that is kind of where things are right now in the marketing of these interventions. A lot of CAM is pre scientific. So they are
Mm.
notions that date back to before modern science. They have not changed much, if at all, since science came along. Um, and they tend to have a one true cause of disease and
Hmm.
a cure-all that they offer. So what I tend to call the boogeyman slash panacea combo. So in
Oh, yeah.
each form of CAM, there's a boogeyman. There's a thing that causes all diseases. And it just so happens that its practitioners have the cure-all, of course, right? So whether it's vertebral subluxations in chiropractic, whether it's the blockage of qi in acupuncture, there's a thing that they know it causes everything, and then they can treat it for you with this one intervention. Which, if we just bring this back to prior plausibility, if we
Mm.
know a thing or two about conventional medicine, we know that there is no one cause of all diseases. There's a reason why
Right.
there are specialties and subspecialties in medicine. And there's a reason why there are many different types of interventions, even just for cancer, which is a fairly common family of diseases. There's radiotherapy, there's chemotherapy, there's surgery, and now we're getting to like biologics and all that kind of stuff. And so this idea that there would be one cause of all diseases and one treatment for all diseases, it beggars belief. And what I find particularly fascinating is that everybody under that CAM tent
Hmm.
seems perfectly content to believe that they have the ultimate boogeyman and the ultimate cure-all, and their neighbor who's also under the CAM tent but who believes in a different system of CAM, they think that you're completely wrong and that they have the one true cause of all diseases and the cure-all. And they never really fight amongst themselves. They're all like, no, it's fine as long as we're opposed to conventional medicine. I won't question the fact that your boogeyman and your panacea is completely different from mine, but we all agree and what's interesting is that in that way that I'm phrasing this, it is identical to how conspiracy theorists think amongst themselves, and that
Mm.
is why there's a lot of
Wow.
conspiracy thinking against big pharma in CAM, which is that you go to a flat Earth convention and you will hear a lot of different hypotheses about the true shape of the Earth. None of them agree on what the true shape of the Earth is, but they all agree that it is not spheroid. It is not a sphere.
And that's what
We have been
unites
sold a
them.
lie. The mainstream narrative is wrong, but they all have their own pet theories as to which one is right. And it's the same thing with CAM.
That is so interesting. So it's like under this one umbrella in which society tends to put alternative medicine or CAM or integrated medicine, like I guess are all these terms. It's like they all get lumped together and they all seem to get along with one another because just like you said, because even though compared to one another, their beliefs are kind of incompatible between
Exactly.
modalities, but they all
Yeah.
still unite and they're all friends because they have this common, I guess maybe enemy. I don't know if that's too harsh of a word, but they do seem to
I
be. I
think
mean,
that's appropriate.
you think that's, yeah. I was just
I mean,
gonna say, yeah,
some of them might be more hand in hand with medicine, right? Like
right,
the integrative folks, and
right.
others are very much opposed to medicine. But there's this general suspicion, at the very least, of the impact that the pharmaceutical industry has on physicians.
Oh
And they
yeah,
are
that's
right
so
to an
true.
extent. I mean, they are right to an extent. And I always refer people to Ben Goldacre's book Bad Pharma, which is written by a physician, and it is critical of the pharmaceutical industry and its impact on the practice of medicine. But then you can take that too far and think that there's this giant grand conspiracy and that all doctors are either complete idiots or they're in the pocket of big pharma, and therefore Reiki is true, which is a leap in logic that you just can't make that.
I was going to ask you about that actually. That I tend to see that argument put forth quite a bit, where it's someone maybe has had a bad experience with conventional medicine, or they've just adopted these beliefs that it's bad or that it's wrong or it's not the answer, and then the next quote logical conclusion is therefore alternative medicine is right. It's like Western medicine I disagree with, therefore these alternatives are the way to go. But that does not seem like it makes sense logically, right?
No, exactly. Like you have to prove that alternative medicine works before you make that leap. And to your point, I do understand. I have seen a lot of medical doctors in my lifetime, and I've also seen a number of alternative, health practitioners, whatever we want to call them. And there's a difference. You go to a hospital or you go to a clinic, and the lighting is horrible, and you're in this
Yeah.
tiny little office, and everything is sterile, and you get maybe 15 minutes if you're lucky, and hopefully
Mhm.
you're on a good day, and the doctor's running late because his secretary or her secretary has booked 25 patients in the day.
Totally.
It's not a pleasant experience, and I'm a man, and I can only imagine how worse it is usually for women, for people of color. That's a long documented history of people who have their symptoms denied, and it's all in your head,
Yeah.
and blah blah blah. Whereas you go see an acupuncturist or you go and see a chiropractor, and I mean, just the first appointment is at least an hour long, and they will
Yep.
often talk to you about your life and what you do and every symptom that you have. And it's a much more calm environment. It's much friendlier. It's more comfortable. They're generally on schedule. And the treatments that they have, they tend to be less invasive. And
Mhm.
it just, the whole experience is so much nicer. And I think that, our healthcare system, if we could afford it, I guess, would benefit from learning from these CAM practitioners on how not the diagnoses or the treatments, but the superficial delivery of all of this care, the human
Mhm.
relationship, the interplay there, and the sort of the general comfort that is elicited by the looks and the sounds and all of that structure. I mean, that shell, if you will, is so much nicer and better. But what I would like to, a real integrative medicine would do that. It would take that shell from CAM of how it presents itself and would marry it with the best of evidence-based medicine. But that's not what actual
Right.
integrative medicine is, unfortunately. But so anyway, all of that to say, I completely understand how fans of CAM
Mhm.
feel about their medical experiences, because I have been there myself. But again, the answer is, as again, to quote Ben Goldacre, when there's a problem with airplanes, the solution is not magic carpets, right? It's not flying carpets.
Yes.
But that is
Yes.
that is a good analogy for what's happening with CAM. It's like, okay, so there are problems with the healthcare system. The answer is not magic, and we'll
Yeah.
we'll get into that.
That's right. It's maybe like a false dichotomy or something to like set those two up as like, the inverse of one another or something. But it's like there are problems with conventional medicine as you just outlined, but there are a lot of problems with complementary alternative medicine or complementary and alternative medicine, in terms of it's not evidence based. At least it seems to me like it hasn't been rigorously tested and shown to actually work as far as the mechanisms that they cite for why people are sick and what will help them get better. So CAM might have great positive aspects, like you said, like the interpersonal connection, more time spent between practitioner and patient, and all of that is so important and very helpful. But there's also a lot more in that whole picture that is not necessarily helpful and not evidence based. So thanks for, yeah, just we could be realistic and we could be critical of a system without needing to outright reject it or pick up
But
something
that's
else
what's
as the,
difficult, right? It's getting to that nuanced
yeah,
dialogue. It's
yeah,
much easier to just throw the baby out with bathwater and then
yes,
embrace whatever is left. And it's just harder to look at a problem and say, you know what, it is very complex. The solutions are going to be hard and complicated, and they're going to cost money. It's a lot easier to seek out simple solutions, and we see this in wellness broadly all the time. Complex problems,
hmm.
simple solutions, but those simple solutions often turn out to be wrong.
Thank you for mentioning wellness because Travis and I did want to ask you. We know you've written about the wellness industry, and as Travis mentioned in the intro, like yoga is really intertwined with the wellness industry. You could say, I mean, I know, I believe the wellness industry is kind of a nebulous, like to actually define what it actually means can be a little
Yes, it is.
nebulous, but
I
could
just
you?
I just reviewed. I just reviewed two books on wellness that came out last year. There's The Gospel of Wellness and Why Wellness Sells, and
Yeah.
both books write that yeah, there is no definition of wellness, and it's this very nebulous concept, and it's very interesting as Colleen Derkach shows in her book Why Wellness Sells. Wellness is often seen like in opposition to the pharmaceutical industrial medical
Yes,
complex,
it
and
is.
yet
Yeah.
when you ask people why you're taking this wellness supplement, they will talk about it in terms of illness. Oh, it's a treatment for this thing that I've been diagnosed with. So they say one thing, but then when they're
Right.
really pressed for it, it turns into no, it is an alternative to medicine. So yeah, so wellness is very nebulous, and because of its nebulous nature, it allows the wellness industry to sprawl and to become whatever it needs to become and to make as much money as possible because it's not restrained by any kind of definition. It is whatever you want it to be. It's a Rorschach
Right.
test.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And what sort of role would you suggest that CAM modalities or complementary and alternative medicine modalities, what sort of role do they play in the greater wellness industry? And maybe they are the wellness industry, or maybe the wellness industry is larger than CAM modalities. What's that connection?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that I think that they are overlapping circles.
Hmm.
I think that in wellness, generally speaking, you're going to see a lot of skepticism of medicine, of conventional medicine, a lot of embrace of alternatives to medicine. Um, I wouldn't say that they're one and the same, but
Hmm.
definitely they feed into each other. This idea that, well, either medicine doesn't have all the answers, or medicine is for treating things when it's too late, whereas you want to prevent things, where you want to be well as opposed to being ill. And so that's
Yeah.
why you do your yoga and you drink your smoothies and you go see your acupuncturist. And one of the things that I learned is the business model of a CAM practitioner, because I saw a chiropractor, I saw an acupuncturist in the past, and basically is they do a lot of therapeutic sessions in the beginning, multiple sessions a week to get rid of this issue that you have. But then of course you have to come back on a monthly basis for maintenance therapy.
That's
And
right.
so you're never done with your acupuncturist, you're never done with your chiropractor. There are always maintenance treatments. And a question that I've asked in the past, I've never had a good answer, is has anybody ever been to a CAM provider like an acupuncturist or a homeopath and been told, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do for you? They always have something for you. They will
Mm,
always take you on
That's a
as a
great
client.
question.
Whereas you will
wow.
often go see a doctor who will say, I'm sorry, like this is outside of my specialty, or we don't know enough about this thing. We don't have a good answer for you. And that, of course, that drives people to go to a CAM practitioner who will, of course, never say, there's nothing I can do for you. There's always something that they can do for you. And that's a red flag right there.
That is such a great point. Thank you so much for pointing out that red flag. I feel like that's a really unique insight that I haven't really heard anyone say before, but it's so true. Like to be honest in what we can offer, like to really understand that will include knowing when we're not able to help someone and referring out, and that does seem to not necessarily be a common practice with many of these CAM modalities. Now, I noticed, Jonathan, that you mentioned both acupuncture and chiropractic a bit ago. And we did want to ask you about, so we've kind of talked in broad strokes about complementary and alternative medicine, but we did want to get your insights on just some specific modalities, especially to give, for some of our listeners, these thoughts, maybe the first time they've heard, like alternative medicine being questioned. Like I remember being in that place when I was just really surprised to learn that some of these modalities actually might not be science based. Like I could see for a lot of our listeners, this being pretty new. I think it would be helpful if we went through a few examples of some specific modalities. And we, on our list, we were going to ask you about acupuncture first, but actually I wanted, because you mentioned chiropractic a few times, and right before we got on and started to record, this is just kind of a little aside, but I had put up on social media in my Instagram stories that we were recording with a very special guest, a science communicator, about alternative medicine. And then I made a little list. I was like, such as, and I listed some modalities just so people had an idea of what we were talking about. And I said like, acupuncture, Reiki, aromatherapy, homeopathy, and chiropractic. And I put that on the list. And I had this feeling that some people would see that and not understand chiropractic being on a list of alternative medicine. And someone actually responded right before we got on and wrote, that looks interesting, like our podcast episode. That looks interesting, but as a physiotherapist, a physical therapist, I don't consider chiropractic as alternative medicine. And I think a
Interesting.
lot of people, at least in my understanding, I think a lot of people see chiropractic as seems very clinical and medical and
They're
science-based. Like
doctors.
they're doctors.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Hmm.
I have a feeling many of our listeners may be surprised could you maybe tell us a bit about why it's an alternative medicine?
I was surprised as well because growing up, I assumed that chiropractors were medical doctors who had specialized in treating back problems.
Yeah, me too, I
That
think.
was my idea. I just picked up on it from my family, from the culture, whatever. It was just in the water. Yeah, of course, chiropractors are physicians who specialize in back problems. They are not. And what we're going to dive into, I did want to plug a book
Yeah,
that I
plug the
showed you guys
book.
before.
Hmm.
So if anybody's interested in doing like a real deep dive into all of these so-called alternative medical practices, I highly recommend the book Trick or Treatment: Alternative Medicine on Trial. Is by Simon Singh and Etsand Ernst. I wish it was more easily available, but if you can find it, I think that it is the best book that I've ever read on CAM. And
Wow.
it's also very gentle. So if you do believe in these things, if you've had good experiences, and you don't want a book where somebody hits you over the head with how wrong you are and how stupid you are,
Right.
this is the right book, because this book really guides you through how we know the things that we know, and each section on each of these modalities starts without giving you the answer. They just go, okay, so here are the claims, and let's look at the history of this thing, and let's look at the studies that were done, and then it's only at the end that you find out, oh, is this based on good evidence or not? So it's a very gentle, well written, very well documented book. So again, Trick or Treatment, I highly recommend it.
Thank
So
you.
to answer your question, and I'm going to be a little bit cheeky about it, and I don't have like all the details in front of me, but basically chiropractic is a guy who decided that the flow of God's energy through your spine was being impaired, and that caused diseases. He cracked the spine of a deaf janitor and claimed to have cured him of his deafness. This is not an episode of The Simpsons. This is literally the origin story of chiropractic. I believe his name was D.D. Palmer. He started a school for this. And this is what, because there's been a split since then. There are like two main flavors of chiropractors, or people who still believe in these original spiritual ideas. They're called vitalistic chiropractors or straight chiropractors. And so they literally believe that there is some vital essence, often referred to as like God's energy, what have you, that flows through the spine. And there are these things, these blockages called vertebral subluxations that happen, and they cause all kinds of diseases. And the chiropractor will do these rapid thrusts of the spine to release that blockage and to allow
Hmm.
this mysterious energy to flow through. Um, at some point, I mean, the way that I put this, I think you realize that this is not based on any kind of science whatsoever. And so at
It
some
sounds like
point,
folklore.
Yeah, I mean, and again, this was pre-scientific, and this was just some guy's
Right.
idea of how the body might work. And history is littered with these guys who thought they understood how the body worked and who were proven to be wrong. And at some point, there were some chiropractors who tried to rescue the profession, and they became evidence-based chiropractors. And they're trying to restrict their scope of practice, and they're trying to see, well, maybe those like rapid mobilizations, maybe they are good for certain things, for certain specific problems. But the original, like the OG chiropractors, really believe that they can treat pretty much any disease, whereas the more evidence-based ones
Right.
are trying to do more like physical therapy stuff. And so there's Sam Homola, who's very good, who has written about this for Science-Based Medicine, a chiropractor who is trying to like see to salvage something from chiropractic. I have been, like I said, I've been to a chiropractor. This was 20 years ago now,
Hmm.
for some neck and shoulder problems, and it was very very funny because I realized this whole time that what was actually beneficial to me was laying down with a hot compress on my neck and shoulders, which she was doing before she was doing the actual treatment. But the treatment itself was doing nothing for me. And so
Hmm.
at some point, I just stopped going. And again, to this thing of like, you need maintenance therapy. She called me up and said, I noticed that you stopped coming to see me. Why is that? And I said, well, I think I figured out that what was actually working for me temporarily was that I was just lying down and having this, you put this hot compress on me. And she got very angry and said,
Oh,
well, if
I
that's
bet.
if that's all that I do that is useful, I should just save myself the work and just have a bunch of tables lying around and put people there with hot compresses on their back. I said, well, maybe that's what you should do. And I hung up.
You said
Uh, so, so
Mm.
that's chiropractic in a nutshell.
I'm really glad that you explained that for us because I don't think very many people know about the history of chiropractic. And is it like the 1800s when D.D. Palmer was, I forget,
I believe so. I mean,
late
as you keep
1800s or
speaking, I will
yeah,
go
yeah.
through my book here and give you a precise date. But yes, I believe it was in the late 1800s. I believe something like that.
Uh,
Right. And sorry,
uh,
I didn't mean to like throw that at you. But yeah, just to give a sense of like where that modality dates back to and kind of like what time period we're talking about. And as you've mentioned, it sounds like there have been efforts to update or maybe create a branch of chiropractic that isn't exactly. Oh, you found it. You found the
So
year.
D.D. Palmer opened his school in 1897 in Davenport, Iowa. So that's when it started, the very late 1800s.
Got
I think
it.
it's challenging because nowadays there are people who are chiropractors and who are trying to practice in an evidence-based fashion in a
There are.
way that's more closely related to physical rehabilitation or physical therapy. And it's tricky because the paradigm that you're operating on is incredibly flawed, right? Yet people still experience positive outcomes
Hmm.
from chiropractic, especially for the things that like that manual therapy, those sorts of joint mobilizations and soft tissue work. Some of those things can be helpful for something like back or neck pain, and it's just tricky.
So it is, we're
Hmm.
talking about like, can chiropractic be rescued and salvaged? I
Yeah.
faced the same question when I wrote about osteopathy recently. I mean, even physical therapy, a lot of it is not based on good evidence. So what is
Yeah.
happening
That's
is
for
that
sure.
medicine has kind of started this whole evidence-based game, and we see all of these other complementary disciplines that are around it, that are paramedical, again in that vague sense, that
Hmm.
are playing catch up with it. I used to work in low vision rehabilitation research, and it was the same thing there as well. A lot of the interventions that were given to people who have low vision, these non-pharmacological therapies that were being given, were not based on good evidence. And we were trying to generate some good evidence because a lot of it was just based on hearsay. And like, well, Dr. So and so has been doing this for 20 years, and apparently his patients are doing well. So that's what's happening with all of these
Right.
disciplines, that they're trying to become more and more evidence based. And they're going to find out that a lot of the things that they've been pushing for have just no good evidence behind them, and they may not be effective in the long run. And so the question is, well, is there anything in these disciplines that can be salvaged to bring the entire discipline into a more evidence-based arena? And that, of course, that remains to be seen.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining that. Maybe the suggestion that some chiropractors who are operating today, if they run their chiropractic business kind of more in the realm of physical therapy, they're treating like musculoskeletal pain, maybe around the area of the back, and they're using kind of more evidence-based methods, maybe similar to something from physical therapy, that maybe that type of chiropractor could be operating more in an evidence-based side of things, but that there are a lot of practitioners in chiropractic where they're not operating within an evidence-based. Just trying to highlight like that there could be some...
and I do wonder like how they would market themselves, right?
I think it's like, well, you're saying you're a chiropractor, but you're not doing the very thing that your
That's the
profession is
problem.
based on.
Mhm.
But then to Jonathan's point, it's like, well, there's a lot of BS in physical therapy too. So you say you're a
Mhm.
physical therapist, and then you're doing these other things for to oversimplify, more active interventions as opposed to a lot of these quack passive interventions.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, what is the profession? What is
Yes.
chiropractic? What is physical therapy? If you're going to do it more in line with what the evidence says, are you still that thing, or are you something different?
Oh,
I don't
these are
know.
such big
There,
and
there,
big
there might
questions.
there might be a day at some point where all these professions coalesce into one evidence-based profession. But the problem right now is that all these people have been trained, they have bills to pay, they have careers, and so you can't just
Yes.
tell chiropractors, well, just become PTs now, because
And
they
the
have
Right.
PTs
to.
wouldn't like that either.
No, exactly. So it's a complicated
Ugh,
situation.
absolutely. But I think the main thrust of our even bringing chiropractic up here is just so people, just to educate our listeners about like the history of chiropractic, and that there is a lot within that domain that is really not science based, and for people to just realize that just because they're quote doc, like they have, I don't mean quote like they're not doctors, but they're not medical doctors, they have the title doctor,
The
and
title
it doesn't
doctor is
mean...
fascinating because I mean, who gets it differs on the language. Like even in French, if you have a PhD, you are not referred to as a doctor, whereas in English
Interesting.
you are.
Yeah.
So this title doctor is just like wellness. It can be a little bit nebulous, and it's regulated in different ways in different countries. And yeah, chiropractors, they get to call themselves doctors, and there are naturopathic doctors as well. And it gets
Yes.
all very confusing as to who is a doctor and who isn't, and what does being a doctor mean.
Yeah, to be clear, it's so true. Jonathan, you mentioned a bit ago naturopathy as a
Hmm.
modality, and that is actually on our list of one that we wanted to ask you about. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Like what that is? And also, I think I hear it as a naturopathy, but I think I've also heard people say naturopathy, and that, and I think you can be a doctor. That's why you mentioned it, because you can be a doctor of naturopathy or a naturopath. We also often hear
Yeah.
what's naturopathy?
Naturopathy is a big umbrella. It's
Hmm.
it's not. I don't consider it to be like one thing. It is many things. It encompasses homeopathy, for example, but also
Hmm. I didn't know
herbalism
that.
and all kinds of different things. And really, to summarize it, naturopathy is based on the appeal to nature fallacy. It's
Yeah.
this idea that if
Thank you for
something is
saying that.
natural, then it has to be good for you and it has to be harmless to you. Whereas if something is synthetic, it is bad for you, it is harmful to you. Which is, again, it's a fallacious argument. It's not true. There are many things that are natural that are not good for you. We're spending a lot of money removing asbestos from buildings, even though asbestos is
Yeah.
natural, because it's not good for you. And there are all
Yes.
kinds of synthetic things that are perfectly safe for you. So every substance needs to be tested for its safety, regardless of its origin. But naturopathy will say, well, if it comes from nature, if it's an herb or an extract of some kind of a
Hmm.
plant, then that is good for it. We can treat everything with those kinds of natural things Mother Nature provides. Whereas
Yeah.
pharmaceutical drugs, oh, they're all synthetic, they're made in laboratories, they're not good for you.
They
But
must
this
be
is, again,
bad.
this is all based on this appeal to nature, which is so strong in the human brain. Like we're all drawn to this bad argument that, oh yeah, of course it's natural, it's good for us, and it's synthetic. Ooh, I don't know, I'm
Mhm.
skeptical about that. But if you know a thing or two about chemistry, you know that everything is a chemical. An apple contains hundreds of chemicals, and they all have these long names that many people can't pronounce. That has
Right.
no bearing on the safety of eating an apple. These are just
Yes.
everything is made up of chemicals, so we have to test each of these chemicals to see which ones are safe and which ones are not.
Thank you for outlining that. I feel like I come across the appeal to nature, and I know that that I have also for sure bought into that as well, like that bias. Like you said, it the human brain, it's kind of just like naturally resonates for us. Like we just want to think like
No pun
nature
intended.
is yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. But I think it's great to raise awareness around that. And I tend to see like the wellness industry in general just be really proliferated with a lot of appeal to nature. And then kind of coming along with that is like a rejection of conventional medicine because that is seen as not natural. And with naturopathy, it's like written into the name, like nature is in the name. But that's just such a really great point that chemicals are in everything. They're in the air that we breathe. We don't need to inherently fear chemicals. And am I correct in suggesting that like pharmacology as a field, I don't know much about it at all, but I believe that a lot of modern drugs that have come from pharmacology are derived from plants, like
Yes, they
a good
are.
amount of them.
So sometimes you have to modify them a little bit to make them more tolerable. But yes, a lot of our modern drugs, come from plants. If they're not directly coming from plants, they are modifications of ingredients that were found in plants that had some interesting activity, and then they were refined and they're dosed properly and they're tested for safety, so that that if you have a headache, you don't go out and take a 1 inch by 1 inch patch of willow tree bark and chew on it, because who knows how much pain relief you're going to get from that. But you can actually go to the pharmacy and get some ASA, and it's going to be easier on your stomach, and you're going to get the same dose in every caplet. So that's the
Right.
basic principle, that yes, there are all kinds of natural chemicals that plants, for example, are producing that may have some therapeutic effect. But there's so much variation in how much you will find in a plant, given the climate, given the season, given the
Mm,
altitude, the soil composition.
so
There's a
true.
lot of variation. Plants are living things, and so the amounts of these chemicals will vary depending on all kinds of factors. And so you wouldn't want to just go chewing on plants thinking that it's going to help you, because again, you don't know how much. And it's not just one chemical you're getting all kinds of chemicals that the plant has. A plant will have
Right.
hundreds of these chemicals. And so what pharmacology does is it might take some some community somewhere saying, oh, we think that this plant has this particular healing activity, and then they will study it. They will isolate the active ingredient that does this. They might need to modify it a little bit to make it more tolerable for consumption, easier on the stomach, for example. And then you safety test it in animals, and then in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, until you know what its effectiveness is, you know what its safety profile is, you have a recommended dosage that you can give to people, you know what an overdose looks like, what the dose of that is, and you can then market this ingredient in the same dose in every tablet or every caplet or every
Right.
pill, to get the same effect each time. That's a good thing, and
That's a
somehow
good thing, right?
there are people who want to go back to us chewing on plants, but there's just so much
Yes.
variability there. It's a little bit like playing Russian roulette. So, but again, there's
Ah,
this
that's such
idea
a
that
good point.
pharmacology and the pharmaceutical industry is all synthetics and it's big labs, and it's scary, and it's not Mother Nature. Yeah, but Mother Nature is red in tooth and claw. Mother Nature doesn't like us. Like there are all
Wow.
kinds of bad things that happen in nature. So we should stop idolizing nature. We can get
Yes.
inspired by nature, and we can derive good things from nature, but then we can use our knowledge to tweak them and make them better for us.
That is so well said. And I think just like really presents the case for something like aspirin that you buy at the drugstore, just being like a really safe and reliable and trustworthy source of a medicine that one might take, and like just kind of helps to break down that illusion that like that's not natural, or just to remove our ideas about like good, bad, and nature and synthetic that are just so oversimplified, and that I know the brain is easily drawn to, but there's
Black
so
and white,
much.
angels and demons. We see this in diets as well. This thing is evil, stay away from it, and this is amazing and great, and it's a superfood. We love those simple stories, but they're wrong.
And on our podcast too, Yoga Meets Movement Science, Travis and I talk a lot about movement, and a lot of it's the same thing. Like a lot of movements become demonized, like that way of moving is always bad, and this way of moving is always good. And just the dichotomy. It's
Right.
just so much overlap there in the way we like to see things. So that's a great take and explanation of naturopathy. Maybe we could talk about just a couple more
Sure.
modalities for the sake of just all of our education, and kind of having more examples to kind of see this. You mentioned, and I think this is a pretty good one, you mentioned homeopathy a bit ago. You said that was part of naturopathy.
Yes.
So maybe it's not its own separate thing, but maybe
Well, it is, and it's very interesting because this is kind of the low-hanging fruit. When you understand homeopathy, either you still buy into it somehow because you've had good experiences with it, or you realize, oh, this is not at all what I thought it was. Because in fact, when I believe it was Health Canada, when they surveyed Canadians to know what their understanding of homeopathy is, most surveyed Canadians did not understand what homeopathy was. Somehow homeopathy has become equated with naturopathy, with herbalism, with natural remedies. But homeopathy is not that. Homeopathy has very, very, very clear and distinct claims that it makes that are very hair-raising and unscientific. So homeopathy came about in the late 1700s, if memory serves, 1790 something. German physician Samuel Hahnemann, back when it wasn't even modern medicine, but back when conventional medicine was, again, leeches and bloodlettings, and people and patients were dying all the time, said there must be a better way. And his answer was not ShamWow, but it was through. It's a long story, and it involves malaria and all that kind of stuff. But basically, he decided that like cures like. So if something gives you the symptom of a disease, that something will be the cure to that disease. So if when a healthy person takes a particular natural substance and they develop the symptoms that look like a disease that is known, then somebody who has that disease should take that same substance to get cured of the disease. So like cures like, which again, not true. It's not how this works, but
Very
that's how
mathematical, though.
Yeah, it's very kind of it's logic. It's superficially logical, but in practice, biologically speaking, that's not how this works. But that's what he thought, and so he started testing these toxins and these poisons and these toxic ingredients on friends and relatives to see what would happen. And he would document this and say, "Oh, this looks like the symptoms of food poisoning, and this looks like this, this looks like that." And so, so as my boss likes to joke, it was not good to be friends with Samuel Hahnemann. But then what he thought was that, okay, well, of course, if you give them the full strength of this ingredient, they're going to get sick. So what you have to do is you have to dilute it. You have to dilute it a lot. And in his mind, you would dilute out the negative effects, but you would preserve the positive effects. And so he would dilute these substances to the point where they weren't even there anymore. He was just giving the water or the alcohol that was used for the dilution. Now it's often put on a sugar tablet. And so that's what homeopathic remedies are now. There's these little sugar granules that received the final drop of the final dilution of this original ingredient, which has nothing to do with the disease that it is meant to cure. And so you're getting a sugar pill. And the idea is that the more diluted it is, the more potent it becomes. So that's what homeopathy is. And so, wow is the correct answer here. So when you understand biology and chemistry and you look at the claims that homeopathy is making, it makes no sense whatsoever. It violates just basic principles of every science that is known to humankind. Because by that principle, if you drink a beer, you get a little bit drunk. But if you dilute that beer, if you take one drop of that beer in a glass full of
Yes.
water, you would just die from alcohol poisoning.
You're so right.
That's
That's like what that would mean.
Yeah, that's where the logic takes you. And so, but the reason why people have good experiences with homeopathy is often because of the placebo response, which is
Right.
that, for a variety of reasons, our those aches and pains and symptoms, they usually go away on their own. The flu lasts about 7 days. With our best medical intervention, we can bring this down to a week. So whatever you do, when you're feeling at your worst, you're gonna get better, unless of course the flu kills you, which it does every year. It kills a lot of people every year, and we don't think about that. But most people survive the flu, and we survive the common cold and all of these little aches and pains. But it feels like we get better after we take this little sugar pill, and that's just association. It's correlation. It's not causation, right? But it's once you
I
have
see what you're
had that
saying.
experience of I was feeling like hell, and I took those homeopathic remedies, and I started to feel better. You have this story in your
Mhm.
brain that, oh, it worked for me. And
Yes.
then nobody can convince you otherwise, because you have personally experienced it.
Yep.
And personal experience is so much more powerful than me writing about homeopathy on the internet, or about a doctor, or about what have you, because you have experienced it yourself.
Right.
You were sick, you took the thing, and now you're better. And even though that correlate that personal experience of correlation is so powerful that it convinces a lot of people that these sugar pills, there must be something to them. But it is one
Wow.
of the easiest pseudosciences to debunk, because again, it is based on these ridiculous principles that predate modern science, that make no sense. It's been tested. The problem, of course, is that there are tons of studies of homeopathy that are poorly done and that look positive, but there are much better, much more rigorous studies of homeopathy that shows that they do nothing. But again, personal experience trumps data, and so a lot of people still take these little sugar pills.
I think that mechanism that you spoke of, well, it worked for me. Like that applies
Mhm.
to a lot of the things that we've been talking about. And then when it worked for you, will you tell your friends? And then they
Yep.
say, oh, well, it worked
Mhm.
for Jonathan. Then they have the expectation, which
Yep.
further going into any of these treatments, if you expect it to work and the provider's telling you that it's going to work, that's going to enhance that placebo effect.
And if
So
you
if you've
have
had that good experience, or
Yeah,
somebody else,
absolutely. And if you have chronic pain, you know that your pain levels fluctuate from day to day. And so when they're at their worst, you're desperate for something. And then you go and you take some homeopathy. And then, of course, your symptoms go back to their average value. It's called regression to the mean. And again, it's
Right.
correlation, personal experience. You feel, oh, I got better. Yeah, well, you would have gotten better anyway, because your pain
Right.
fluctuates. And so that little scenario there, your symptoms are at their worst, you're desperate, you reach out for anything you can find, your symptoms alleviate a little bit, they go back to their average value. It becomes this very convincing story that, oh, well, it must be this thing. And you don't realize that, because of course we can't split reality into two. I mean, of course, some people believe in the multiverse,
Right.
but if we were able to do that, you could do an experiment where you take the homeopathy in one universe and you don't take it in the other, and then you see what happens. And that's why we do randomized controlled trials. It's because we can't split the
Right.
universe into multiverses. And so we do it in this way that approximates this by randomizing people into groups, making sure the groups are comparable, giving one group the treatment, the other one a placebo that looks like it, and we follow them and they don't know what they're getting. And then you see, is there really a difference?
Thank you for explaining that and just doing more science education for people to understand like what a
And the
randomized control trial
multiverse is
looks
very
like.
in right now. So that my example was very, very fashionable.
I love that example of like, yeah, yourself in two different universes and like you made find out that you would have gotten better anyway. But because we can't do that, then there's the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy where it's like
Very
after
good
this
Latin.
because of this. Thank you. And then it's just then we're just our brains are so prone to bias. So things happen in a certain order. I took this homeopathic remedy and then I felt better. And then you just attribute that as a cause. And then as Travis pointed out, you're so right, Travis, then we add on, we lump on, like, then you have an expectation about it for the next time. And then, so I guess I'm really glad you brought up placebo and the placebo effect, Jonathan, because we had wanted to ask you about this. Wondering, because I do think that many of these modalities that we've been talking about, and others as well, can help people, especially I think with things that are a little more like subjective, like pain, things like that, or that fluctuate. They might help them, but it might be because of these placebo effects or contextual effects. So if, to the extent that that may be true, like if, say, acupuncture, which I know we actually haven't gotten into, maybe we'll get you to tell us a little bit about acupuncture, but like if acupuncture, someone goes and then they feel better after, do you think the fact that placebo
What's
could
the
be
harm?
yeah, that's my question. Yeah, exactly. Like,
Oh,
well,
that's such a
they
great
felt better.
question.
So like, could we
Yeah.
still do it or recommend it if placebo is part of it? That's exactly the question. What's the harm?
So, very quickly, acupuncture
Hmm.
predates science by a lot, and it's this idea that inside the body are things like rivers, like the rivers of China, and we have this life force called qi that flows through it, and sometimes there's a blockage of this qi.
That's
But what
right.
acupuncture used to be like was bloodletting. They were just using these needles to
Right.
let fluids out, and it's only recently that we've had the technology to make hollow needles that are very very small needles that you can insert and to do what we consider now to be acupuncture. But that was not acupuncture for most of its existence.
Wow.
So
And
again,
those,
we're rewriting history with acupuncture.
oh, that makes so much sense. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was just going to ask, you said the rivers of chi that flow through
Uh-huh.
us in this modality, are those called meridians? I think our listeners will be familiar with that.
Yes, exactly. Because if I get this correctly, at the time, the Chinese did not want to do autopsies. They saw this as like a violation of the body. And so they didn't know what the body looked like on the inside. And they just looked to nature as a symbol, as an example. And they thought,
What?
well, we've got all these rivers. And so that must be how the body works. Again, like all of these hypotheses are fine when you don't have better knowledge. I mean, you just go, oh, maybe
Mm,
it's this, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. But it's just that now we know that we don't have rivers inside the body. We have blood vessels and we have lymph vessels and we have a good understanding of biology. And when you look at the chi points, on the one hand, they don't correspond to anything really, biologically speaking, but on the other, there are so many chi points that they're all over the place, and so they can be whatever you want them to
that's
be. And
right.
there are different maps of these chi points. So depending on which acupuncturist you go see, they're using different maps. So it's it is what it is. And some people have tried to bring like a veneer of science to acupuncture by saying, well, maybe there's a release of endorphins at the point of insertion. And
Hmm.
from what I've seen, the studies are not very clear or conclusive on that. But anyway, your question was basically what's the harm, right? Which is what every journalist asks me all the time. Well, yeah, but what's the harm? There's a lot of potential harm. The first one is financial, right? As I was mentioning, you get a lot of treatments up front, and then you have maintenance treatments, and those treatments are not free. You might have insurance that covers those things, but you may not, and so that's a lot of money out of your pocket. And what are you really getting out of it?
Hmm.
Maybe you're getting a temporary relief in pain, as I was with the chiropractor. But then I
Hmm.
found out that I could do exactly the same thing for free at home by putting a hot compress on my
Yes.
shoulders.
Yes.
So I saved myself a lot of money that way. Then there's also the fact that any intervention carries some risks. With acupuncture, there are rare but documented cases of pneumothorax where the lungs are pierced by the needle and you start to
Oh,
lose air through your lungs, which is not good.
wow.
I'm not a doctor, but I can tell you that is not good. You
Yeah,
need to go to the hospital.
that's right.
With chiropractic, there's also rare but documented cases of vertebral artery dissection. So when they thrust the neck very quickly, sometimes it creates a rupture in one of your blood vessels in your neck, and that is also not good.
No.
I saw an acupuncturist for a little bit and it wasn't doing anything. And then he started to say, well, if you really want the full thing, you need to go get yourself some herbs from the local Chinese shop.
Oh, that's
And then
right.
I learned that a lot of these herbs, they have liver toxicity. They are not
Oh,
good for your liver. And sometimes you don't quite know what herb you're getting from the shop, and they may not know themselves because some of the herbs look the same, and sometimes there are substitutions and alterations. So that's another issue. So there are actual physical harms that can happen to you. There's also the delay in getting proper medical care for something
Yeah.
that for which you might benefit from going to see a doctor by thinking that, oh, I'll be fine, I'll take this alternative stuff, and then 6 months later you realize, oh, this is not working, and now my tumor is bigger. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a very real danger. There's some people who have died from eschewing medical treatment and going with an alternative instead, and they've delayed medical care to the point where doctors couldn't help them in the end. So there's all of that,
Wow.
and there's also this kind of rabbit hole that you fall into when you go see these practitioners, which is that, again, if you think that you have the one true cause of all diseases and the cure all for everything, then of course, if your patient has cancer, you're going to be tempted to say, I can do something for you.
Yeah.
Because you think you have these, godlike powers. You know what causes everything. So, I mean, different practitioners, will think about these things differently, and some will realize that no, there are things that I can't treat. But these notions are very seductive because, again, if everything is due to a blockage of chi, then you can help anybody with anything, right?
Yeah.
Where are the limits to what you can and cannot do? And so when you go see these practitioners, you might start to you develop this relationship of trust with your practitioner, right? Because they treat you well, and you have a whole
Mm-hmm.
hour with them, and you talk with them, and they may start to say things about pharmaceuticals, and they don't recommend taking drugs, and are you taking these vitamins and these supplements, and oh, I sell them, by the way, by the
Mm.
counter. And so you get
Totally.
drawn into this anti-pharma, anti-medicine community, and this can have repercussions further down the road. And again, as we said at the beginning, there are good criticisms of medicine and of pharmaceuticals for sure. But what often happens in CAM circles is the very simplistic demonization of this whole thing over there, and a
Yeah.
replacement with essentially what is wishful thinking, what is
Yeah.
pre-scientific guesswork of how the body works, and that is fed to by the therapeutic relationship that you have, and with a number of placebo effects that play into that. It makes you think that it is helping a little bit, and you want to please the person that you're seeing, and you're spending a lot of your money into this as well, and so you are financially
Yeah. The sunk
involved.
fallacy.
The sunk cost fallacy, and
Yeah,
I'm
sunk
not a
cost fallacy.
sucker. Like I've been seeing this person for 3 months, and I've spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars. I
Right.
can't be a sucker, so I have to continue doing this. So all of these things
Oh my
give you this idea
gosh.
that it might be working, but you're getting drawn into this. I mean, I don't want to say that all of these practitioners are conspiratorial in nature, but again, this
Right.
anti-pharma sentiment is very
Is a
strong in CAM
problem.
circles. And so
Mm-hmm.
you start to hear this stuff, and maybe you start to believe it, and that changes the decisions that you make for your own personal health care.
Would you say opportunity cost would be a good way of describing, okay, I'm doing this thing, but I should really be getting proper medical care? like the what's the harm? Well, the harm is that
Uh-huh.
you've now wasted or spent time doing this thing that hasn't helped when your situation has gotten worse and you should have been
Yeah, yeah,
seeing
yeah, yeah.
a
There is definitely this cost of, like, if you have a degenerative condition,
Mm-hmm.
a worsening condition, and you delay proper medical treatment because you think that this softer thing, this nicer thing, this
Right.
natural thing is going to help you, and it doesn't, because again, it's not based on good evidence, then you are delaying proper medical care, and your situation is worsening. And as we all know, doctors can do more for you early on than they can when your progression is worse. So yeah, that is a very real harm of complementary and alternative medicine.
the we mentioned the appeal to nature. Another one that what you just mentioned came to mind, the appeal to antiquity. Is that the
Yes,
correct?
that's another big
So
one. Yeah.
the idea of like this, you said pre-science. The way that the other way of looking at it would be ancient wisdom.
Yes, exactly. It's been done for thousands of years, Travis. Surely they
Yeah,
wouldn't
I mean
still be doing it if it
that
didn't
that
work.
that was very encouraging to me back in the day when I explored some of these things. I had gastrointestinal issues and I saw an Ayurvedic doctor. And that was one of the allures, I think, was not only is this more natural, we're going to treat through diet, but this is something that's been around for 5,000 years.
And science just
Yeah.
hasn't caught up to it yet.
Somehow, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And but the counter argument is, yeah, but physicians used to do bloodletting for hundreds and hundreds of years.
So
Not
true.
because bloodletting works, and I mean, there's very few indications nowadays to do that, but because there was nothing else, and they just did it because they thought they were helping the patients. And if the patient died, oh well, it was the will of God or something. We did what we could. So just because you've been doing something for a very long time does not mean
Yeah.
that it works or that it is good. And then the flip side of that is the appeal to novelty, which is, oh, it's new, it must be better. No, just because a drug is new, and that's something that we see with the pharmaceutical industry. They'll show you a new drug. Oh, it's new, it's new. Yeah, but if it's not better than the standard of care that has been used for decades and whose safety profile is well known, and where it's a generic drug and it's much cheaper, then no, doctors should not be prescribing the new treatment. They should be prescribing the older treatment. So again, these are all these fallacious arguments, these bad arguments that we fall for on the spot because we think about them superficially. But when we think about them a little more deeply, we realize, oh no, this is a faulty argument. But it's very appealing. This appeal to antiquity is very, very strong. And in fact, for traditional Chinese medicine, this was bolstered by what happened during the Cultural Revolution in the mid 20th century, where they realized that they didn't have enough doctors in the countryside. And so they brought back these old folkloric traditions like acupuncture, and they taught that to those doctors away from the cities. And that sort of reinvented traditional Chinese medicine. And now we think that it's something that they've been doing for millennia in exactly this way. But it actually had to be brought back because they didn't have enough doctors, and that was just a cheap thing for them to do.
So it's not, yeah. So it sounds like traditional Chinese medicine, we tend to think of it as ancient and therefore extra powerful, but it sounds like you're letting us know that it's actually not so ancient. Not that it even matters, because that's a fallacy anyway to place value on something because of that. Jonathan, you've done such a wonderful job today of really just addressing our questions and really insightfully kind of outlining your perspective and a scientific perspective on all of these modalities.
I hope I've not angered too many of your listeners.
We'll forward the hate mail to you.
Oh, great. Thank you.
I was wondering if before we totally wrap up, can I ask you one final question that I think just might be extra?
No, you can't. We're done. I'm on the clock here, Jenny.
One final question, which you could totally just give us a quick answer for, but I think it's like a relevant one for our audience. I'm not sure if you're familiar with or aware of this, but in the yoga world's kind of broad, and there are various yoga styles, and yoga is taught in from different perspectives and in different ways. But there is definitely a faction of the yoga world where yoga is used as maybe a therapy or used as medicine. Like that's kind of the verbiage that we hear, the wording, like yoga as medicine. And just wondering, do you have an opinion on the idea of yoga, the practice of yoga being used as something like medicine or to treat conditions?
I have not looked deeply into this. I am very, very skeptical of that claim. I would refer your listeners to the podcast Conspirituality, that is hosted by Matthew Remski, Derek Barris, and Julian Walker. Who all or most of them have backgrounds in yoga practice, and who have also denounced the excesses of the yoga world and a lot of the problems with certain yogi and the unsubstantiated claims behind yoga. I would not use yoga as a healing practice. I have done yoga for many years at home, and it's a wonderful stretching exercise. But even I've written about stretching, and even stretching, there's a lot of mythology around the benefits of stretching that are not substantiated by the evidence. So I don't want to be popping too, because I think your typical listener might finish the episode thinking, well, I guess nothing is real and nothing matters, and become very,
Right.
very cynical. No, it's just that when we are okay with changing our beliefs in the face of better evidence, it
Yeah.
means that we don't waste our time on things that don't work. We don't waste our money on interventions that are not effective. And it allows us to make better use of our time and our money. And it allows us to also lower our expectations for what something might do to us. We mentioned Paul Ingram beforehand, and there's a lot of criticism that he has of massage therapy and the benefits
Mm-hmm.
that it claims to bring to you. But as far as I know, he still goes to see a massage therapist because it feels good. And
Mm-hmm.
I've had massages as well, and they feel good. So
They're
we don't
relaxing.
always, yeah, exactly. And so we don't need to have these unrealistic expectations, these big like health claims. Oh, it's going to cure this, it's going to help your body heal from
Right.
that. We can just say, you know what? Maybe this just feels good and I
Yeah.
enjoy it. I enjoy yoga. It makes me feel good. I feel more connected to my body. I feel more grounded. It
Yes.
teaches me to feel my body in space. It's good for my
100%.
core. It helps me take a moment for myself. Right.
Mm-hmm.
We're all super stressed and we've got bills to pay and we've got bad news all over, all over our phones when we're scrolling through Twitter. And sometimes it's good to just take a little bit of time to ourselves and to breathe. And for some people, that's reading a book.
100%.
For other people, it's doing a session of yoga. And so yoga doesn't need to cure your cancer to be helpful. It can just be a
Love
half
it.
hour that you spend uh, being inside of your body and letting go of your anxieties. And that is a good thing.
I love that answer so much.
Good.
Thank you for
And
offering that.
I'm
Yeah.
trying to rescue your listeners from cynicism and nihilism here.
That's that's right. That yeah. Yoga is can be an amazing practice. So many people are drawn for it for very many good reasons, but we don't need to maybe make claims about it that are unsupported or that really blow out of proportion, like what it may
And
be
there's a
offering.
community aspect also of like exercising with other people and getting to
100%.
know these people and making friends. And like I go to the gym as well, I take classes, and it's I didn't think that I would enjoy it as much as I do, but like being there with other people,
Yeah.
and it helps you give yourself 100%, and you also make friends. And it's that whole community aspect is good for mental health as well, and for socializing, and that's not nothing. That's very, very important, and that
Very
also has
important.
health benefits in the long run, right? But it's just not going to cure your cancer. That's that's all I want to say.
I love that. And thank you for pointing out. I was thinking in my mind about the community aspect as you were talking about all the great benefits of yoga. That's another huge one. I'm so glad you said that. So yeah, yeah, not to discourage anybody. It's actually, to me, I find it like really encouraging, but just to see these modalities more clearly. Like what are they actually doing? How are they working? How are they not working? Then we can use them more wisely and just be more intentional. Um, so Jonathan, thank you so much. Oh yes, where okay, we will put all the links to all of your stuff in the show notes. But where can listeners like where would you direct them to learn more from you, follow your work?
So all the articles that I write for McGill are available at mcgill.ca/OSS. The
Mm-hmm.
podcast that I co-host with an actual medical doctor
That's
is
right.
called The Body of Evidence. It's very fun. We try to keep it light and comedic, but we delve deeply into what is the evidence behind this or that intervention. So that's the Body of Evidence. You can find it wherever you get your podcast. It's also at bodyofevidence.ca. And on social media, I am mostly on Twitter now. I'm hoping that it doesn't go down in a giant ball of flames.
Totally hear you.
I started a post.news account. It's very, very quiet. I can hear the crickets. But that's my plan B in case Twitter goes to hell.
I looked for you on Instagram and I didn't find you on there. Travis and I are both on Instagram a little more.
I'm not on Instagram.
Yeah.
Is definitely the platform for like wellness influencers, and like
Yes.
you want to post your photo of you doing yoga at sunrise on the beach.
In a bikini.
Uh, I don't do that, so I don't have an Instagram account.
I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. Yeah. Well, thank you for letting our listeners know where they can find you. I personally think your work is super important and you do a really wonderful job at it.
And to plug once again a book that I had nothing to do with, but that is excellent. It's called Trick or Treatment by Simon Singh and Etsan Ernst. Hard to find, but if you can find a copy, it's like a 400-page version of the conversation that we just had, with
That's
a lot
awesome.
more information and references, and it's very, very well written, and I absolutely love it.
That's perfect. Thank you for directing our listeners there too, for anyone who wants to learn more, because clearly there's so much more one could dive into with all of these topics. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of this knowledge and insight with our listeners. We so appreciate it.
Thank you once again for the invitation.